really our best guess at it based on everything that, all the information that we can gather on it. Well, that's a whole other discussion, but I won't go there. So now the focus here on what I've been working on lately is this idea of model co-creation, sharing, and peering. So over the last, well, it depends on how you count it, but basically over the last decade I've been working on this idea of conservation planning prioritization. And during my postdoc in South Africa, I had a chance to program it into a tool in Model Builder. So it's a prioritization tool. It uses weighted criteria. It's a return on investment model, so it uses cost and benefits. And it has this novel feature called continuous benefit functions, which makes it so we don't have to set our arbitrary target levels when we're programming the prioritization analysis. And also it accounts for and suggests different management types, not just protected areas. So these are a couple of the features that I've gotten the most enthusiasm from people that have seen the details. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, how to share it? So part of the answer is, oh, actually, this slide is a little bit mislabeled. Just a little bit more about it is that it's in Model Builder, which allows a drag-and-drop GIS programming, so you don't really have to know language to understand the program that went into it, or actually to add to it. It's released open access, not widely released yet, but the idea is that it's a framework that's customizable. It's not just for the problem that I originally programmed it for, which was for site selection. Basically your standard reserve design question. So as an example of how it's flexible and customizable, Jen over the last couple of weeks has taken some of the key components of it and was able to program a lot of work in Model Builder that she used to do manually. And so this is still a draft in progress that still needs to be vetted with the team. But here's an example of road decommissioning priority analysis for the El Dorado National Forest. The red roads are the roads that have the highest, that seem like they would be really good candidates for road decommissioning. They probably need more field work and more analysis. The idea being here that one of the things is that this is a weighted multi-criteria analysis. So up here at the top, you have the ecological benefit. And by the way, can people see my cursor, or do I need to turn on a little spotlight?
We can see it.
Okay. How's that? Is that better? So here in ecological benefit, isolation index combines with reduced soil erosion and stream crossing. And you can change the waste in there, and that's kind of one of the ideas behind it. Jen is going to no doubt be giving more of the detail of this in the coming weeks. But the point I wanted to show is that you're programming this in the ArcGIS toolbox. You're actually making models that can be shared with people in other organizations, and they can go ahead and they can change the weight, and you can do this in a workshop setting with stakeholders. And then the output is fairly transparent in the fact that you have those eco-benefit values for the final values. You could rank them, but you could also see what went into it. So the best road segment for candidates for decommissioning, you can see, well, it was mainly because it crossed the streams a lot of times, had a decent isolation metric, but also it had highly erodible soils. So that's what made it the top. And so you can see what's going on here, and that helps also with the weighting discussion. So the Wikinomics angle of this is, one of the things that really he emphasizes in the Wikinomics book. We need to totally think about things differently and totally think about the sky's the limit. No longer be limited by our original thoughts about possibilities. So one Wikinomics angle is why not think about having such a tool be applied on every forest in the country. I mean, I know we don't have the staff to do that, but theoretically it could happen in this Web 2.0 Wikinomics universe. What about having a developer community out there that's volunteer-based and that's making it more user-friendly, and so you don't have kind of those clunky inputs and outputs? What about partners that are working on this, adding new analyses and new metrics, because there's hundreds that can go into it, and each analysis could be more fine-tailed. And these are the type of questions I was asking about LifeScape decision support tool in general. Oh, this is a temporary name. I think I mentioned that later. So, so how to effectively implement conservation science for such a thing? One of the things I've drawn from these books is you got to really know and avoid the dark side of economics. Work on implementing emerging best practices and adapt. And some of the things that I've gleaned from the books and from common sense is, in general, the major dark sides of economics is the idea of the ignorance of crowds, that this new process really circumvents the gatekeepers. We're no longer relying on editors of newspapers, magazines, journals to tell us what is quality material, and that applies to a lot of different things. The morphing of intellectual property, some people say this really reduces the driving force of creativity, people not being able to maintain their intellectual property. I think in conservation, one of the big things is that people might exhibit poor judgment about data sensitivity. I know it's in a different field, but the whole thing about the release of all the classified documents in Afghanistan a month ago is an example of what some would say the dark side of economics and Web 2.0. And what would happen if something like that happened for conservation for some endangered species that was blocking some development, or I know the Forest Service doesn't actually publish the locations of the biggest trees and things like that. So basically what I'm saying is that we need to, if we do go down this route, we need to be really aware of what these are and make sure we build in and checkpoints to make sure that some of these things are still filtered appropriately. Of course, Anthony Tapscott, the guy who wrote the book, would reprimand me for such a statement. But anyway, he'd say, "Oh, that's old school thinking." But
John, I had a question about the second bullet there on the intellectual property, and it seemed, even from the introduction to the book, that the hypothesis is that you end up creating so much more wealth in an open source type of environment that essentially you don't need to worry about those old intellectual property type of concerns. And I'm wondering what your assessment is of whether that is, a little bit of hyperventilating in the book, or is that really likely to be true?
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. I actually don't think that this is a really big issue, but that's my personal take on it. And I'm not a musician, for instance. But yeah, I feel, for instance, when it comes to modeling, I feel like releasing things open source, open access is totally the way to go. When it comes to conservation, we got such a huge battle to fight, or huge mountain to climb, or whatever metaphor you want to use. I don't think we should spend time worrying about intellectual property rights. That said, these were the two major things that he bulleted in his book, and so I figured I'd throw that out here. So yeah, I think it's more along the lines of hyperventilating in the book, but I think we need to be aware of it as a potential dark side. So yeah, and everybody feel free to jump in with any questions. I think I have maybe 5 slides or so to go. Now, some of the emerging best practices are in the book, The Principles of Economics. He really goes into detail about all these. The introductory chapter actually does a nice job of summarizing all these, but really these principles of being open, sharing widely, peering, which is this idea of having other people work on things collaboratively with you, and this idea of thinking globally. And yeah, we can get into more detail about those. This phrase, promise, tools, bargain, this is from the Shirky book, and this is all about when he says, okay, what are really good, successful communities? And he says they get the promise right. It's not too big. It's not too small. They get the tools right. Tools work, and the bargain is right in the fact that the end users or the community that wants to be involved feels like it's a fair bargain, like their volunteer time is being valued and they're getting enough out of it. And I won't cover the law now. Wikinomics by design is a really nice, like several pages out of the Wikinomics book, starting at page 309. Each one of these is about a paragraph or so. And so when you're actually really wanting to do this, some points that I gleaned from that and change the order around a little bit is to supply an infrastructure for mass collaboration, start a culture for collaboration internally. So make sure you can do it as a team internally first before you try and go to other organizations. Take the time to get the governance right. Some organizations take years to do it. Make sure all the participants and the volunteers can harvest some value. Take the cues from your lead users, really create conditions for trust and kind of develop a community, and consider pilot projects. So that is the major things I gleaned from that for this presentation. So in July, I released a beta version of the infrastructure to support the LifeScape Collaborative. It's now driven by volunteers. It uses the Atlassian software. Confluence is similar to SharePoint. It's a little bit more community-oriented. And Jira is totally different than SharePoint. It's really good at using at tracking tech and issues, and really good for distributed project management. So people all being able to work on similar projects with no real leader, but just working as a team and keeping all the track issues straight. I grabbed this from their webpage. It's used by 11,500 customers. A lot of these big businesses are using it. Some great open source projects are using it. So I encourage you to browse that page if you're interested in it more. And yeah, as I mentioned, the LifeScape decision support tool and LifeScape collaborative names are just placeholder names. Taking to heart that comment, get the governance right and the site right. We're going slow on that, and if anybody has comments on that, I'd be happy to hear from people and discuss that as well. So I think in short, there's a lot to be done, but with teamwork, I think that the conservation movement has a lot to gain from this. I think our organization as a whole has a lot to gain from this direction, and our department. So I think it's clear to everybody where my bias is. I'm enthusiastic about these possibilities. Recognize that there's challenges, but I think it's worth